For our first lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of desktop publishing and document design. Many courses that are taught today covering the same material that we will be covering in this course are actually called document design rather than desktop publishing. So, as you registered for this course, you may have asked yourself, what exactly is desktop publishing? And I think that's a good question. So the definition that we're going to be using is that desktop publishing is the process of preparing documents. We'll get into more about what a document is a little bit later in this lecture, for printing by using specialized page layout software. Now, some of the features of desktop publishing, or the attributes that actually make it desktop publishing, are that the software contains various tools. Those tools include ways of arranging or laying out the different design objects, which might be photographs or text, shapes, underlining, all of that kind of stuff, right? And then it needs to contain some way of printing or sharing that information to others once you put it in that format or design that you like. Now, before we had desktop publishing software, we had something called photo typesetting. And photo typesetting was a way of arranging the text through the movable type features that go back to like maybe the more than 1,000 years ago, or around 1,000 years ago. And then if you go back about 500 years ago, you had the printing press, right, which enabled Gutenberg to print the Bible, for the 95 Theses by Martin Luther to be widely disseminated to people. So what you had then was a way of taking a much longer process of like writing out the information in by hand, multiple copies in order to get it to people. So you had like individual letters which could be rearranged on they were metal, right, and then or wood sometimes, and then you had a some sort of plate where images would be raised so that when ink was applied to them, you could produce multiple runs of the same information, right? So that was a big improvement over copying everything by hand, but it still took a lot of time and had a lot of effort involved in producing, right? Whereas with desktop publishing software, changing something is much easier. You have a lot more options and it's a lot quicker. Now, even when I was younger, we had typewriters, right? And just to make a correction to something took a lot of effort. If you made a mistake, you might have to start all over again on something, or you had to white it out. So if it was and it wasn't easy to like insert pictures into something. So desktop publishing gives us a lot of ease of producing documents that look good. Now, part of that ease, there also becomes an expectation. So today, what you might have been able to just write a quick report years ago on a typewriter and that would have been perfectly acceptable, today that same report would be seen as not looking very professional. If it looking like it was produced on a typewriter would be seen as a critique these days, right? Rather than something that looked professional. And desktop publishing is also WYSIWYG, which is what you see is what you get. So what you put on the screen in your design is actually what's going to appear when you print it or share it. Now that's different than like if you're coding something, right, using HTML to create something. What you put into the computer is not what comes out onto the screen. Okay, so that's part of the ease of desktop publishing. You don't have to learn a language, right? Somebody's done that for you on the back end. So what is document design and how does it relate to desktop publishing? We use desktop publishing software in order to create documents that are aesthetically pleasing. But document design goes beyond just making something that's pretty or nice to look at. When we're talking about document design, we're thinking about creating documents in a way that allows the reader or the user to easily find and understand the information that we want them to have. So the placement of information on a page becomes important. The size of the text is important. If we want readers to see and read and understand something, we have to make it easy for them. We have to make it engaging for them. We have to make it meaningful for them. And we can do that through how we design the document. So we keep talking about designing documents, but we need to really think about what is a document. Most of you would probably agree that a book is a document. I don't think I'm going to have a lot of argument from you there. A report. You'd probably also agree that a report that you create in a professional setting or a lab report for a class is also a document. But what about a cave painting? Is that a document? What about the tag on a piece of clothing? Is that a document? And what about the home screen on your phone? Is that a document? If we look at the traditional definition of what is a document, it's marks inscribed in some way onto a surface that convey and preserve meaning. So if we look at each of these items in that context, we could probably say that in some way these are all documents. And really, somebody has to design each of these, right? So a book, you have text inscribed onto a surface, which is the page, and they convey meaning. And that meaning is preserved by the nature of this physical object. And certainly, in this cave drawing or painting, we also have marks that are inscribed onto the surface. We don't understand the meaning any longer, but at some point people did. And that meaning has been preserved for a very long time. And people have been able to understand from the context of studying lots of these different drawings, they've been able to develop and understand meaning for many of these symbols or icons that are used, right? And then also even the tag on your jeans or other clothing that you have, there are definitely marks inscribed onto a surface that convey and preserve meaning, right? They tell us what our clothes are made of, how to wash them, how to dry them, what not to use on them to preserve them in some way. And I'm sure there's thought that goes into trying to make sure that the ink that is used and the material that is used, lasts and preserves the meaning that is conveyed there. And when we get into electronic documents, so to speak, it gets a little tricky, right? In that definitely what we see on a website or on our phone, there are marks that are inscribed onto a surface, and they are meant to convey meaning to us, right? Whether it's pictures or text. The people producing those sites are trying to convey meaning to us. Now, the preservation gets a little tricky because things can change over time. It's much easier to change things in electronic media and forms. Mostly in this class, we're going to be focusing on creating print documents, but much of what we're going to be learning can also be applied to the creation of documents for various electronic or digital mediums. So when we're designing documents, there are three primary players involved in the design process. Now, if you're taking this class, you're going to be using desktop publishing to design software, to design documents. And in general, we're not just designing documents for our own purposes or in a vacuum, right? We're thinking about who is going to be using these documents. And that's an important distinction. Using, not just reading. Certainly we do read documents, right? But out in our daily lives, we're not always just reading for entertainment or for the sake of reading. We're often reading things in order to help us achieve some sort of purpose. We're using the documents. Whether we're using the document to make a decision, to get informed so that we can make a decision about what car we want to buy or what university we want to attend, or maybe we're using a set of instructions in order to put together a piece of furniture that we bought, right? So in general, people are not just reading the documents that we create in a class like this or in a professional setting in our workplaces. People are using them, and we have to keep that in mind and think about what are they using them to achieve and to do, and who are these end users that we're trying to reach, so that we design the documents in a way that will be helpful to them. In addition, a lot of times there's an intermediary between the designer and the user, and that often is the client of the designer. So your client could be yourself if you own your own small business and you also are the person who's designing the website for your end user, right, for your customers. But oftentimes, if you're hired to design something by somebody, the client is the person who hires you. So it might be the small business owner who hires you to create a website or to create a brochure or many of the other print documents, maybe even business cards, right? Or a logo for the company. So the client has customers in mind that they are trying to reach, users of the various documents that they need. And they might not be capable, they might not have the know-how, but they know the customer and they know their product. They know what they're trying to sell or what they're, the information they're trying to get across. And it's important as a designer to know both your user and your client. What does your client want? What are your client's preferences? What are their needs? What are their limitations? All of those factors are important when designing. So you have to take each of these players into account. Although sometimes, as I indicated, one of the players can have a dual role. So we just mentioned design limitations. What are the limitations when we're designing documents? What will we face? Why aren't all documents beautiful? Now, sometimes it can be because of time. We have a deadline. We have an event coming up. We need to have some documents to advertise the event, maybe some posters, maybe a logo for the specific event or organization that's being represented in the poster. And we only have a certain amount of time to be able to get that document or poster together and out there advertising to the public, right? So you have time constraints. You only have so much time to put into something. And also money. Maybe the person, can't afford a full color ad, so we have to think about putting that into into black and white copy for somebody. Or maybe they don't have the finance for a full page ad somewhere, and they only have a quarter page ad, so that's what we have to work with. Or it just goes on and on and on, right? Maybe we really think it should be on this glossy paper when this brochure is printed, but maybe they can't afford that paper. So, or maybe they only have so much money to put into the design work itself, right? So time and money play together here. And also ability. If you are designing for your own company and you've got a little bit of knowledge, but not a whole lot, you can't hire somebody to do the work for you. And so, your own ability to be able to use design software and your understanding of design is going to affect the products or the documents that you were able to produce. And the ability of the people you hire when you're hiring somebody, right? And there's a whole range of abilities out there when it comes to designers. Some are much better than others, and generally the better ones are going to cost more money. And then client preferences. When you're designing for a client, sometimes they will have their own preferences and stipulations, and ultimately you're trying to do two things, right? You're trying to put the best design forward that you think will be most effective with the end user, but you also have to keep in mind what the client's preferences are. And sometimes they might not agree with what you know about document design, and you might have to make some concessions. You might have to compromise. You can certainly try to steer a client in the direction. You can make a case for whatever it is that you're suggesting, but ultimately the client, you have to make them happy, because if you don't make them happy, they're not going to maybe use what you produce, or they're not going to hire you for future jobs, give you a good recommendation. So there really is a mix there, and you have to learn to be diplomatic in dealing with clients, and like I said, trying to steer them, but doing it in a way where you're not going to offend or upset the client. So as we start studying document design, it's important to develop a vocabulary with which to discuss it with other people. We might all see a poster hanging in the hallway for someone renting an apartment or selling a textbook and think that it looks terrible or unprofessional. Yet, when we start to produce our own documents, sometimes we might feel the same way about them. We know they look terrible, but we don't know why, or we don't know how to talk about what it is that's making them look less than professional. If we develop a vocabulary, we can start discussing together and get an understanding of what makes for good document design. And know we're talking about the same thing because we're using the same words. So one of the most important things to first understand is, what is a design object? In this document here on maintaining social distance during COVID-19, the letter P would be a design object. Individual letters are design objects, as are the words that are formed by joining letters together. So I can look at P, the individual letter, as a design object, right? And I can manipulate it in various ways. I can also look at a word as a design object, or an entire sentence, or even a paragraph as a design object. In addition, images and icons and symbols can also be design objects, or are design objects. Additionally, positive space is space that is filled up by these design objects. So the words here, or even I can look at this block of color as a design object. This rectangle, it is a design object. So are the arrows and the dotted line. And then those are all design objects, and they fill up positive space. The negative space is the area around design objects. And that negative space can also play an important function. Here we have this white negative space, but it's separating out the design object from the yellow rectangle in the middle, or this other area of negative space is doing the same. So negative space can be important in that it gives separation between our design objects. And if we don't have enough negative space, a document can be very crowded feeling, right? And that can also lead to that feeling of, this looks really unprofessional. So design objects. So when we're talking about all of the things that make up the positive space, or the space that's filled in, are design objects. The negative space is the space that surrounds those objects. So now that we know what design objects are, we can talk about the different ways in which we can manipulate the design objects to create different effects. And those would be the 7 visual variables: shape, orientation, color, texture, value, size, and position. So back to what we were talking about in the last slide, a P has a certain shape to it, but there are different fonts in which that letter is shaped differently. So when you change the font, you're changing the shape of something. So anything that takes up two-dimensional space, the way at which it fills that space, the space that it fills, is its shape. So here we have an arrow, right? And we can make arrows in lots of different ways. So we could alter that shape. We can also make other kinds of shapes. Or in the case of letters, we can alter the way the letters look. They have different shapes. Those are called fonts. Now we can also alter the orientation of our shapes, the way in which they appear on a page. Like this arrow can point any of the different directions that it just went. We can also alter the color of a design object. So we could have that arrow in red, or that letter or word, or the text box surrounding something. We can have it in blue or black, all kinds of different things. We can also add a texture to an object to make it appear as if you could rub your hand across it and feel something, right? So sometimes objects will look as if they have a wood grain, or they'll look like fluffy or rough, okay, or smooth. Those are all the textures that we can apply to design objects to make them appear different from one another. And we also have various values, right? And value can be a little bit tricky to understand, but you have to think of it in relative terms, right? That this has a low value, this black arrow, because it's very similar to the background in which it's set against. But I can change the value of it. This gray stands out perhaps a little bit more. This lighter one stands out even more, so it has a higher value, and then the white has a very high value or contrast against the background. Now, this is a relative term, right? Because if we had a white background, then we would have low value with this white arrow and high value with this darker grayish black arrow here. Another way in which we can alter or change a design object is its size, right? This arrow could be very small, medium, or large. But again, those are relative terms. If I just look at this in and of itself, there's nothing to tell me this arrow is small or large. It's only when I look at it in comparison to these other arrows that I might call it small. So size can be both relative and absolute. If I have very fine print on a document, I call it fine print because it's small compared to everything else on the document, right? But I can also have absolute size. So I could say this arrow measures roughly, depending on your screen size probably, right? But if I put it on a document and I printed it, I could have it at 2 inches. I could have it at 5 inches. So I can determine size and talk about size in its relation to other objects, the size of a design object, or I could measure it and talk about its absolute size in inches, feet, etc. And then finally, position. If you look, there are arrows positioned all over this page. This one's towards the top of the page, this one's towards the bottom of the page, this one's to the right of the page, this one is more towards the left of the page. But again, I'm talking about them in relation to the page, or I might talk about their position in relation to other objects. So manipulating these variables helps us to achieve the design that we want in our document, a design that will be effective and easy for our readers, users, to use to gain information or figure out how to do something. Now that we've developed some vocabulary for documents and the design objects that appear in those documents and ways about talking about how we manipulate those various aspects, I want to discuss some principles to use and apply to our documents in order to produce aesthetically pleasing designs. So at this time, I'm going to talk about 6 principles of design, but sometimes you might hear about 4 principles of design, or you might hear about the CRAP principles: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So, this is just a construct. It's one person's or one school of thought about these design principles. So first, let's talk about contrast. Okay, and you can have contrast in all of those different visual variables that we talk about. So if we look back to this social distancing poster, there's contrast in the application of color. We have the blue icons representing people against the white background. There's a high contrast, so the blue really stands out against the white background. We can also have contrast in size, so that of the text at the top, please keep your social distance, is bigger than the, to reorder the poster number at the bottom, right? And the www.compliance poster, because that information isn't going to be as important for most people or the users of this document. The document's aimed at the general public, and the message that they want to get across is please keep your social distance. The text at the bottom is really more for the person who might be ordering or using or putting up these posters to be able to order more. So it's important, but it's not as important as that main message, so it gets a smaller size. But that contrast, right, is important. It's the difference. Contrast is how items differ from one another. So you can have contrast in color, contrast in size, contrast in value, contrast in the position, right? So we contrast in orientation. So we have two arrows here, and one of them is pointing to the right and one of them is pointing to the left. That's a contrast in the orientation of those objects. Sometimes we have letters appear vertically to stand out from the traditional sort of horizontal placement of words. So contrast is simply making things different so they stand out from one another. Now, similarity, often called repetition, right, is using the same application of those variables, right? So it's using the same shape multiple times. So in this instance, we have the same font used in most of the document, and the size of it might be different, but the font itself is the same, or it might be bold, or it might be a different color, but the font is the same. Sometimes you'll see lots of different fonts used in a document, and it can make it look really busy and unprofessional. Sometimes you'll have a heading in one font, and then all of the headings and titles will be in one font, but then the main body text might be in a different font. In that case, the contrast, there's a contrast, right, in that the shape is the same, the font is the same for all of the headings, and then that's similarity or repetition, but the contrast is then the body text is different from the headings. So when we glance at it, we can easily see what the main body and the headings are, because all of the body text is the same, all of the headings are in the same font, but then the contrast makes the headings stand out from the main body. They also usually stand out in size. Headings are usually bigger, right? Also, repetition is using the same color throughout a document. So you see that the people are in blue, these icons, and then 6 feet apart, in the arrow is in blue, and it's kind of, bringing those things together, or in this case, setting them apart, right? That, yeah, they're supposed to, but that all goes together. The message is those people should be 6 feet apart. So the people are in blue, and so is the 6 feet apart. There's also repetition of orange in the orange block at the top, and then the border that goes around. Okay, so you don't want to have, and here we have, maybe 3 or 4 colors, right, in this document. And that's generally what you want to do, and is not have like 57 colors in a poster, right? That starts to look like grade school science fair. Like, I know how to use rainbow text, and so I'm just going to make everything look different and colorful and fun, but it ends up looking less than professional that way. So you want to use repetition to reinforce that things are related in some way. So all headings in the same color, the same font, the same size, unless they're a lower level heading, and then they might be still in the same color, still in the same font, but maybe in a smaller size. Proximity. The proximity is how near or far things are from one another on the page. So in this instance, you have like blocks of words. Please keep your social distance is at the top, meant to get attention, right? And then a little lower, all sort of placed close together, as this social distancing means keeping 6 feet apart from others, right? And so that message is all close together. And then dropping down further apart is this information on where you can go for more information in the website. But all of that information is close together. So you see you have these like sort of blocks. And in proximity, you're usually marrying the content relationship of items with their physical placement on the page. So things that are more related to each other are kept close together. Things that are not as related are placed a little further apart. And then alignment. Alignment is, you see that in how we design like paragraphs, right? So paragraphs are all aligned. They start in the same place on the page, but then they might be indented to show that that's where a new paragraph begins. But all of the paragraphs will indent to the same tab or to the same spot. One's not 2 inches over and another one's, half an inch over, right? The beginnings all align with each other. And then the indentations all align with each other. And that helps us to understand something about those blocks of text and their relationship to one another. So in general, when we're designing objects, we don't want to have too much centering, because centering, there doesn't seem to be any strong alignment. In this document here, we do have some centering of the text, right, within the blocks. But we also have some alignment going on. So you see the tops of the heads of both of the figures, right? Those align with each other perfectly. You could draw a straight line across from one to the other, and the same thing with the bottom of them. And then at the bottom, you also have alignment between the text underneath of the border on each side. One aligns to the left and one aligns to the right. So alignment, again, can help us to understand information. It helps to organize it. It helps it to look better. And when you align things together, it shows that they have some sort of relationship with one another. That relationship might be, this is the beginning of a paragraph. This is also the beginning of the paragraph, because they all start in the same spot. Or it could be these two people, these two icons of people are related to each other in some way. And that is that we want to show that they're kept 6 feet apart. And so that text in the middle sort of bridges that gap there and shows us that these two things are equal, they're both people, and they're meant to stand 6 feet apart from each other, and they both are related equally to this message in the middle. Order. Order is how you place the items on the page, what comes first. So often order can be like sequence, like when you're doing directions, you want to put the first step first, right? Titles, or in this case, the main message, is often put at the top, or something to get people's attention. So it's the order in which the design objects are encountered on the page, and how you want to draw people into your document and how they need to receive the information. So what comes first, what's important to come second, what do we want people to notice? And then enclosure. In this document, we have the border that encloses everything, and then we have an enclosure in the top where we have this text box behind where we're keeping that please keep your social distance information all together. But then we also have another enclosure in the middle where we have information about social distancing and keeping 6 feet apart, and all of that information is enclosed by that yellow box. But we have another larger enclosure of that negative white space, and on each side, which encloses the people and sort of puts them in their own little bubble, so to speak, right? So enclosure can be made by white space in which everything, or negative space in which everything is related to each other. It's enclosed in a similar space, and it also separates it out from other design objects on the page. So sometimes that enclosure can just be the negative space, and sometimes it can be filled in with color or a border to like reinforce that enclosure by use of more positive space. So as we finish up today, I just want us to think about the fact that we are surrounded by design every day. We drive down the street and we see it on billboards and buses and bench ads. Every website that we encounter has been designed. Every t-shirt that we look at and read or wear. The signs that we see hanging in the bathroom or to remind us of good hygiene, especially in the age of COVID-19. The magazines that we read and the movie posters that we see hanging in the theaters are all designed by someone. So throughout the rest of this class, I want you to just be aware when you're walking through the halls, if you happen to venture onto campus, or as you drive down the street, just with everything you encounter, think about the fact that the document was designed by somebody and start thinking about the principles that we've talked about and how the various design objects and their visual variables have been manipulated and controlled in order to get a message across to the user in an effective and aesthetically pleasing way.